What's up guys, I'm BTC. Blizzard confirms more armor changes coming with potential damage increases to several heroes, and the worst ability in the game is likely to stay that way. Just recently, Jeff Goodman, one of the Overwatch developers, had a little conversation talking about some of the things that are going on in the game and what they can expect for changes in the future. There was some topics like role queue, for example, but we really didn't get any new information out of that because they essentially just say the same thing that they always say about that, where it's something that they could consider, but it would be difficult to implement, and they just kind of talk in circles a little bit. I mean, I fully expect them to do that because they do have plans, but they're not at liberty to discuss it just yet, so they really can't answer, so you can't fault them for that. But he did talk about some other things and gave some more information, and one of the big ones was an upcoming armor change. One of the things that they talked about was the pulse rate, the tick rate for certain attacks from Winston, Zarya, and Symmetra, and how they have to balance the way that it feels versus how much damage it actually does. In addition to what he said during this little interview, he also made a post on the forums. Let me quickly read it. It says, "The armor change I'm referring looks like it isn't going to make it to the next patch, so it will probably be the patch after. Those particular changes won't be massive, but right now, all channeled effects, Zarya, Symmetra, Moira, Winston, etc., are reduced by a flat amount like any other source of damage, but the size of the damage packets is purely based on how fast they tick, even though the tuning of the weapons are done via a general DPS calculation. For example, Winston's Tesla cannon was initially tuned way back when to have a faster update rate because it felt a lot better to use it that way. However, currently, that also means that he does a lot less damage to armor. We're getting some new tech which allows us to separate armor reduction amounts for these effects from their update rate. This doesn't mean we're going to just go through and buff all these weapons necessarily, but we are going to go through them all and make sure we're happy with how much damage they are all doing to armored targets." He mentions 4 characters specifically: Winston, Zarya, Symmetra, and Moira. The only one of those that I don't think is going to get a damage boost versus this new armor mechanic is going to be Moira, and the reason is because she just got a massive damage increase when they changed the armor from -5 to -3. In fact, she has one of the biggest damage increases in the game versus armor, and I don't think they're going to buff it even more with this. However, Winston, Zarya, and Symmetra, I think, are almost certainly going to get more damage whenever they do this armor change thing. Now, some of them might get more, like Symmetra might get the biggest change in total about it, but I definitely think those 3 characters will see a damage increase versus armor. The other major topic I want to talk about is Reaper. Jeff Goodman and IDDQD, who is the person who was interviewing him, had a little back and forth about how the character is either incredibly powerful or completely worthless, and there really doesn't seem to be any middle ground, any room in between those two things. Jeff Goodman mentions how he can be very strong when he's up close, but one of the main problems with Reaper was that you have to find a way to get in close to the enemy without just simply running straight towards them, because otherwise you'll get destroyed. So they have the ability, the Shadow Step teleport, that's supposed to allow him to teleport behind the enemy and sneak around. And he also followed this up with a forum post that he says, "We may still do something with Shadow Step in the future, but it's not likely to suddenly become something you do in combat like Tracer's Blink. It's meant to be a way to sneak behind the enemy lines, to drop on them or otherwise ambush them. In the past, we've buffed it towards further reinforcing this direction, like increasing its range and reducing its sound range." Maybe I'm being a little bit paranoid here, but from that first sentence where it says it's not likely to suddenly become something you can do in combat like Tracer's Blink, I can't shake the feeling there's a tiny bit of anger in that sentence, and he possibly might have seen my teleport rework video, and just maybe he doesn't like me all that much. I don't know, maybe I'm just overthinking it. But let's get back on track. The first big problem I see with this is he seems to be admitting that it is an out-of-combat ability, and Shadow Step is the only true out-of-combat ability in the entire game. And that just seems really weird in a game that's based entirely around combat and having these group fights. Having one ability that you need to use out of combat just doesn't make any sense. On top of that, it's the longest animation of any normal ability in the game. It's a little bit over 2 seconds where you're completely locked out of control of your character. It's really loud, it's incredibly easy to see, it's almost as bad as McCree's High Noon, and because you can't move, basically it's like free headshots for anyone that's even looking at where you were or where you're going. Not to mention that the targeting system for the ability is so frustrating, it seems to be actively working against you, particularly if there's a fence on the other end. But all of that aside, when he talks about the character teleporting behind the enemy and sneaking around, that is not how you play Reaper. That is the single most ineffective way to play the character. If you look at any high-skill Reaper player, they never do that. There's a really important distinction that I want to make here, and it's something you're going to see in the gameplay a couple of times. There's a difference between using Shadow Step to simply get on high ground faster than running there, versus what he is suggesting, which is using Shadow Step to get behind the enemy team and then sneak around all stealth style. There's a big difference between those two things. You just don't do that. Yeah, it might work in the lower brackets where people don't have the best game sense and maybe they're not paying attention, but you never ever see the high skill players do that. More than 90% of the time, the higher skill Reaper players are right there with their team. They're 5 to 10 meters away from their tanks and their healers. They stay with their team because that is the most effective way to play Reaper. So you have an ability that is counterproductive, that is counterintuitive to the most effective way to play the character, and it doesn't make any sense. And the funny thing about this is IDDQD actually brings this up with Jeff Goodman, but it's about a different ability. He talks about McCree's High Noon, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing here, but he mentions how he doesn't even want to use the ability. He never wants to use High Noon because it's pretty much an instant free kill for the enemy team, and he just doesn't want to use it. If he does use it, it's pretty much just to get the free reload, and that's it. I don't understand why Blizzard has these abilities in the game where they're counterproductive to the effective strategy of playing the hero. The best way to use Shadow Step, the best way to use High Noon, is to not use them. Can you imagine a Soldier player not using Helix, or a Junkrat not using the remote, or a Reinhardt not using Fire Strike? Like, that's kind of the equivalent. Why would you do that? Why would you put abilities in the game where the most effective strategy is to not use them? Now, I want to clarify something because yesterday I talked about game balance and how Blizzard can do things to try to be more creative to balance a character for both the higher bracket and the lower bracket. But we're not talking about specifically game balance here. We're talking about effective strategies. And the pros and the high-ranked players in Master and GM, they know what the most effective strategy is for any particular hero. They're going to do what is most optimal in order to win the match. If you're doing anything other than what they're doing in order to win the match and in order to play the character, then you're playing the hero wrong. What you're doing is less effective or completely ineffective in some cases. You should always be trying to do what those higher skill players are doing because they already figured out the best way to play the character. This whole situation with the Shadow Step and sneaking around behind the enemy reminds me of quite a similar situation with Torbjorn. More so the older version, but also a little bit of the new version. But specifically the older version of Torbjorn, you would have to place the turret and then build it up. Now, the higher skill players would then just kind of leave the turret alone, let it do its thing. They would run out, they would collect scrap, they would give the armor to their teammates, they would deal damage, and then if they needed to, they could run back and either repair the turret at the end of a fight or simply place a new one somewhere else. But the lower bracket, less experienced Torbjorn players often wouldn't do that. Instead, they would stay right next to their turret and constantly try to heal any damage it would take. They would spend more time trying to heal the turret than actually dealing damage to the enemy. Constantly babysitting the turret is the most ineffective way to play the character. For Reaper, the most ineffective way to play the character is to teleport behind them and sneak around trying to play some stealth Rambo game. It just doesn't work. And again, I don't know why they would be encouraging it. Shadow Step is effectively what is called a noob trap ability. It's something that looks like it might be really good, but the more experienced players recognize it for what it is, and that it has an extremely limited usage, and therefore you don't want to use it the intended way. So whatever the game developer thought you're supposed to do with that ability, no. You don't actually want to do it because it doesn't quite work as well as they thought it would. And that is exactly what Shadow Step is. It is a noob trap ability. So that's the end of my rant. I had to get that out of my system. So anyways, what do you guys think about these more future armor changes and the fact that Shadow Step is probably going to continue to be the worst ability in the game for as long as the game exists? Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more, subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss anything. Also, come hang out in my Discord server and my Twitch live stream. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters. If you'd like to see what kind of cool VIP rewards you can get, check the links down below. And remember, always blame the controller because it's never your fault.